Before I really start, here's a bit of a heads up to viewers who are easily offended. Darwin's picture of New Zealand and its populace was less than flattering. Were it a TripAdvisor report, it would come out to about 1 to 2 stars. Darwin was of course an observer, a prodigious chronicler. He wrote down his daily life in great detail. These are his writings, starting from arrival to departure and including Christmas 1835. If you were after an insight about what New Zealand life was like in 1835 from the perspective of a visitor, this you will get in spades. However, you won't like it, not one little bit. That's a cool sound effect, eh? And take some deep breaths and accept it was 1835 and not 2021. People have thinner skins today and political correctness wasn't a thing back then. Nor do the mainstream journalists these days tackle these writings in their full ferocity. They give but snippets, doubtless fearing a backlash. That is why it is vital to support independent historians and creators like myself by subscribing, liking and sharing. Therefore, just to give you the heads up, and a weak excuse to use the sound again, amongst the unpalatable things he details in his 9-day visit, in terms of the Europeans he encounters, he calls them the refuge of society. Undoubtedly and unequivocally, Darwin reserves the most scathing commentary for the Maori population. In his comparison to Tahitians, he opines, brings conviction to the mind that one is a savage and the other is a civilized man. You now know where this one is going. Not all of what he talks about in details are by modern standards offensive or paints New Zealand in a bad light. But if you don't want to hear any more of his pejoratives, best to tune out right now before you get any further. Then there will be those that will want to play the racist card. For those people, it is probably good to bear in mind that it was Darwin, after all, that raised the spectre of all humans having a common ancestor. One of the greatest, if not the greatest, botanists of history. To say the least, the origin of species didn't go down well. His views at the time were revolutionary, bordering on heresy. So much so that he delayed the publication of his opus, fearing the backlash. He was also a leading abolitionist, alarmed to see the practice was so widespread amongst Maori during his time in New Zealand. Still, regardless of what any of us think today, no amount of teeth gnashing will change the historic record. Of all the men who lived, this was one who ranked near the top of keeping detailed, unambiguous records. To reiterate, these are a selected section of his writings. I doubt, though, many of you today viewing this will want me to recount the minor botanical extracts from his diary, weather, that sort of thing. The mundane, like going for tea at the missionaries and a walk on the beach. Every library has the whole log if you want the rest of the story in its entirety. Think that War and Peace was a mite on the short side and you needed something chunkier to read when you go on a holiday. Before we get into the details, Darwin was now exactly 4 years into his second of 3 voyages, one that would change the way humans saw their place in the scheme of things. He and his crew yearned for home. Life on the HMS Beagle was basic at best for the 26-year-old. He shared a 3-metre square cabin with 2 other ship's officers, sleeping in a hammock which can't have assisted his chronic seasickness. For the 74 men, this wasn't a cruise. There wasn't a different show on every night and 3 bars to choose from. So let's now take a peek at his journal. I'm going to try and go in a chronological order as best I can. This starts on December the 21st, 1835 and ends on the 30th.
In the morning we entered the Bay of Islands, reaching anchorage in the middle of the day. In several parts of the bay, little villages of tidy-looking houses are scattered close to the surface. Extreme quietness reigned over the whole district. In the afternoon we went ashore to the larger group of houses which hardly deserves the title of a village. its name Pahia. There are 200 or 300 Englishmen there. Their whitewashed houses are very neat. The hovels of the natives are so diminutive and paltry they can hardly be perceived. I should think a more warlike race of inhabitants could not be found in any other place in the world other than New Zealand. This warlike spirit is evident in their smallest actions, although at this present day, from the progress of civilization, there is much less warfare. The whole scene, in spite of its green colour, has a rather desolate aspect. The sight of so much fern impresses the mind with the idea of sterility. In the evening, I went with Captain Fitzroy and Mr. Baker, one of the missionaries, to pay a visit to the local village, Kororodika. Looking at the New Zealander, one naturally compares him to the Tahitian. Both belong to the same family of mankind. The comparison tells heavily against the New Zealander. He may perhaps be superior in energy, but in every other respect of his character, he is of a much lower order. Their houses are filthy, dirty and offensive. The idea of washing either their bodies or clothes never seems to have entered their heads. All hovels have the same form and dimensions. They resemble a cowshed with one end open, but having a partition a little way in with a small hole in it, making a small gloomy chamber. The introduction of the potato has been the most essential benefit to the island. It is now very much more widely used than any native vegetable. The inhabitants can never perish from famine. I was very much amused seeing the greeting ceremony of rubbing noses, or as it ought to be called, pressing noses. Several young men, redeemed by missionaries from slavery, were employed on the farm at Waimate. These young boys and men appeared very merry and good-humoured. What a contrast to the filthy hovels at Kororodiki. The forest was almost entirely composed of kauri. I measured one of the noble trees and found it 31 feet in circumference. With regard to the animals in the woods, I saw very few birds. For such a large island, the only indigenous animal I observed was a small rat. Late in the evening, I went to Mr. Williams' house, where I passed the night. I found a large party of children collected for Christmas Day, all sitting around the table for tea. I never saw a more nicer and merry group. We walked to the village of Waimeo, a distance of 4 miles. The daughter of the chief was a heathen who had died 5 days before. Her body was exposed between 2 canoes, which were placed upright on the ground, and was protected by an enclosure bearing wooden images of their gods. Her gown was fastened to the coffin. The relatives of the family had torn their flesh off their arms, bodies and faces, so they were covered in clotted blood. The following day, officers found the woman still howling and cutting themselves. 30th December 1835. I believe we were glad to leave New Zealand. It is not a pleasant place. Amongst the natives there is absent that charming simplicity which I found in Tahiti, and of all the English, the greater part are the refuge of society. Neither is the country attractive. I look back but with one bright spot, and that is Waimate and its Christian inhabitants.
So there you have it. That's enough of slating for one day, I think. A Reader's Digest of Darwin's Journal. As an oversight, a large part of that voyage was spent at the very bottom of South America observing these people. The Selknam. 50-odd years later, this charming bloke, a Kiwi, Alexander Cameron, would take part in the massacre of the race. You can learn about that piece of buried history in a video I've done on the sordid incident. The link in the description. By the way, throughout his life, Darwin did continue to correspond with New Zealanders from his British estate, and geologist and explorer Julius von Haast, botanist William Travers, and his now mate George Gray were amongst the group. Were you still to be pent up and fuming over the content in this video, wanting to leave negative feedback on Charlie's appraisal of life in New Zealand in 1835, some 140 years after he died, there are still a number of Darwin societies worldwide for you to vent your spleen. I'll leave it to you to Google them up. Thanks to my loyal subscribers for keeping the home fires burning, and be sure to support all independent creators on YouTube. All the best, and I'll spot you next time. Bye for now.